Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Tracy Newman. I am a pediatrician and the medical director at the North Dakota State University Center for Immunization Research and Education, otherwise known as CIRI. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Alycia Halladay, who will be presenting this webinar titled The Real Science of Vaccines and Autism. Alycia Halladay is the Chief Science Officer for the Autism Science Foundation, where she oversees all of the scientific activities, grant programs, funding projects, and scientific initiatives of ASF. This includes a weekly podcast and a year-end summary of research for families. Prior to joining ASF in 2014, she served as the Senior Director of Clinical and Environmental Sciences at Autism Speaks. She has authored over 24 peer-reviewed papers in science journals around autism spectrum disorder, with a focus on the needs of the underserved and underrepresented in scientific research. Alycia also served on the board of directors for Phelan-McDermott Syndrome Foundation and Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, and currently serves on the Board of Health Research Alliance. She is on the editorial boards of Neurotoxicology and Frontiers in Pediatrics. She received a PhD in biopsychology from Rutgers in 2001 and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey in 2004. She still holds a faculty appointment at Rutgers. She is the parent of a 14-year-old daughter with ASD. Dr. Halladay, welcome. You can begin.
Thank you. And in the interest of making sure that there's plenty of time for questions, I'm going to go ahead and just launch it and get started. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I will say that I do not have any financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. And I wanted to just lay out some of the objectives of this presentation. The first is to provide a history of this vaccine autism debate. The second is to describe the scientific evidence confirming or denying an association between vaccines and autism. And third is to identify commonly held myths around the relationship between vaccines and autism. I know there's a lot of discussion about vaccines in general nowadays. I'm going to be focusing it on autism. So if there's any questions about vaccines in general, I'm happy to pass them along to somebody who could probably answer better than I could, but this is going to focus on vaccines and autism. So where did this, when you said, like how would you in a million years link vaccines and autism? Who came up with this? Has it ever really been tested scientifically? What does the science say about the link? And if you're old like me, you remember it coming up about 25 years ago, and now it's coming back up again. Hasn't it been resolved already? But most importantly, how do you talk about this with concerned families? How do you address this, or how do you have that conversation? And I know many of you have very short interactions with families. So, you know, what are the main points you should hit on? So vaccines, I'm sure you've heard, are a victim of their own success. First of all, this is what, when you see a story about vaccines, a media story of vaccines, this is what you see. So why on earth would a parent get excited about giving a vaccine? You have all these people holding this child down, the child is screaming, not knowing what's going on. Where are the pictures like this? These are actually my daughters after they received, I don't know, some vaccine. I don't even remember when this was. They look like they're about 3. So, but they don't seem to be upset. They're not crying. Nobody's holding them down. So I want to tell you a little story. In a pediatrician's office, I heard somebody's parent say, polio? Why does she need a polio vaccine? I haven't seen a case of polio since I was little. That person was my mother. My mother is a really, really smart person. She has a master's degree in public health, and even she was wondering why there should be a polio vaccine at one of their well child visits. Luckily, it was a very short conversation. You know, it wasn't, she kind of said that and said, yeah, what was I thinking? But this is the sort of thinking that goes through people's heads as they're hearing polio vaccine, tetanus. Who gets tetanus nowadays? So, you know, I think, again, they're a victim of their own success. I think one of the big issues around vaccines and autism is that over the past 20 years, scientists have seen this increase in prevalence of autism. And so they want to look, parents want to look for the easy thing or something that would cause it. What what has been going up along with the prevalence of autism? Well, first we know that the main driver in the changes in prevalence of autism is access to services. So 25 years ago, insurance companies were not allowing coverage for autism-related services. People didn't even know what autism was. There was a lot less, there were a lot fewer, there's not enough, but there was a lot fewer doctors that were treating autism, and certainly screening for autism was not part of regular pediatric care. So here are some examples of some correlation does not mean causation. So over the past 20 years, we've seen an increase in organic food sales in the United States. Does that mean organic food sales causes autism? We're also seeing a decline in going to church. Does that mean that that families that don't go to church are at higher risk for an autism diagnosis? Well, certainly not. So these are just two examples. Even though the prevalence of autism is increasing, it doesn't mean that there's one single factor driving that increase, and certainly correlation does not mean causation. So we'll go ahead and move to, do vaccines cause autism? So first, I know not every one of you are autism experts. I don't expect you to be, but probably most of you at least know someone with an autism diagnosis. And the complexity of autism has only increased with our increased awareness and access to services. So you have everyone from my daughter to this girl, Katie, that I met at an event. Her t-shirt says, "Kiss my Asperger's." She was very, very well spoken. She was interviewing me for something she was doing on a school project. And then you have cases of autism that go all the way to my friend Kerrigan here. Kerrigan is nonverbal at age 11. She has significant seizures. She probably will never go to a mainstream classroom. She needs significant support, and she will her entire life. So you take somebody who is, of course, very verbal, very smart, probably a little active, but very odd language, and then all the way to someone who has severe medical problems, and then even medical comorbidities, as well as being nonverbal and cognitively disabled. You could see that it's a complex series of things. And so it's very unlikely that one thing, even one gene we now know, does not cause autism. And so the core of autism are these social communication deficits, which is this either deficits in communicating needs or interacting socially, and then the presence of restrictive and repetitive behaviors, including everything from self-injury to even insistence on sameness. But in addition to those core features, there's also these higher rates of other like comorbid things. So you have everything from irritability to gastrointestinal problems, sleep problems, epilepsy, as I mentioned earlier. And then along the spectrum of autism, you have intellectual abilities or disabilities, language skills. So somebody could have fluent language or minimally verbal, and then adaptive functioning. So they could be independent and live quite independently. I have friends who are autistic and have law degrees and are partners in law firms. I also have friends with children who will never be able to live independently, that they're struggling to find resources as they grow into adulthood, and sometimes you reach the service cliff. It is a little bit kind of makes it hard for researchers to better understand the autism spectrum when there is such a wide autism spectrum. So I agree that is very challenging, and part of what I do at the Autism Science Foundation is try to encourage research that looks across the spectrum and look at differences across the spectrum, because that really will help people identify what are the services that people need the most. So again, given that there's such a wide variety or wide spectrum of core autism features and then presence or non-presence of these comorbid features, including psychiatric and physical comorbidities, intellectual abilities, language abilities, and adaptive functioning, it's unlikely that there is just one single thing causing all of it, because it wouldn't make sense. So there is ample evidence, and I'll talk about some of it, that vaccines do not cause autism. So first, it's been studied, and I'll talk to you about those studies in a minute. They found either no association or even slight protection, and I'll show of vaccines against autism. I'll talk about that. Autism does run in families. So those very first studies that were looking at clusters of autism. Even I live in New Jersey, even here in New Jersey, that was looking at groups of people that had autism that lived close together. They started out identifying autism in family members. Now, at the time in the 1990s, it was thought, okay, there must be an environmental toxin. That's why there's so many cases within families. But as it turns out, it's actually caused by complex genetics. And these genetics are either what are called common and rare variants. So rare variants are variants or mutations that are very, very rare, right? So rare variants, doesn't that make sense? So it's a mutation that strongly influences an autism diagnosis, that very, very few people have them. And if you have it, you probably have some sort of problem, whether that's cancer, whether that's a psychiatric issue, whether that's some sort of developmental problem. And then there are common variants, which we all probably have maybe a half a dozen of these. If you have enough common variants on autism genes of interest, that increases your probability of having an autism diagnosis. So we know that there are both common and rare variants associated with autism. There's about 200 genes right now that we know of. And then that genetic link means that it's probably it's probably prenatal, right? So genes originate upon conception and then kind of direct how cells connect. They direct how brain cells interact with each other, how the brain is organized. And this all happens before birth, before a vaccine is ever given. So there have been strong links to the genes that control these things, like neural connectivity and how cells kind of divide and spread around the brain, and autism. So there's very strong links there. If anything, and we need to study this more, there are gene environment interactions. It's not just one thing, which is vaccines. Also, the behavioral features of autism can be seen before 6 months. So we talk about how autism is diagnosed around 2 years of age, or at least could and should be. In the United States, it's typically not diagnosed until about 4 years. But you can see these symptoms, these very subtle symptoms, by doctors can see them before 6 months of age. And of course, this is before any of the vaccines of interest, like the MMR, have been administered. You can also see changes in the brain having to do with everything from the amount of fluid in your intracerebral spinal fluid space in your brain, as well as the surface area of the brain. Those things can be observed. They're very subtle changes, but they can be observed by 6 months of age. So again, this is way before some of the vaccines of interest have ever been administered to a child. There have been, believe it or not, even though we have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in research around vaccines and autism, there has been some interesting studies that have been replicated over and over again around different exposures and the probability of having a child with autism. So these include air pollution during pregnancy and illness during pregnancy. COVID has not been ruled out. COVID during pregnancy is a possibility, but it hasn't been ruled out. But we're talking like flu, urinary tract infections, things like that. Being very premature or having very low birth weight, parental age. So the older you get, both mothers and fathers, the more likely you are to have a child with autism. Then also things like maternal diabetes, preeclampsia, and having false labor. We lump them together into something called difficult pregnancies. I know that's kind of a vague term. Pesticide use during pregnancy has also been linked. And then use of an anti-seizure medication called valproic acid, which is now black labeled, or the term where there's a big label. If you're pregnant, do not take this medication because it is a teratogen. It has also been associated with autism. So if you look at the relative risk, and I'll talk about what this is, or the odds ratio, you're talking about a doubling of the risk of having a child with autism, a 2 to 3 times. So prematurity and valproic acid are very, very high. By themselves, these environmental factors, the increase in probability is statistically significant and should be addressed, but at the same time, it is not 50 times. It is not deterministic. It's only increasing the probability. It is not in any way deterministic. And I did include the references to this slide at the end, so you can have them. So when you look at kind of what the concern is around for parents about why they would resist, not refuse, but even resist. This is a meta-analysis. Really, vaccine adverse reactions and general safety concerns are very high, but the third highest is risk of autism, and this was done in 2023. So some of these studies that were included were older, but some of them were quite newer, and this continues to be across the world a concern for parents that they feel still that there is a risk of autism after giving a vaccine. I'm here to tell you that there is not. So when I had my slide said, how did this get started? Well, it got started in 1998. There was a paper published that was since retracted in a very well-considered journal called The Lancet. It's based out of the UK. It was led by Dr. Andrew Wakefield, and this is a picture of him. I know you can't really see the paper. The title of the paper was Iliolymphoid Nodule Hyperplasia, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's gastrointestinal kind of hyperplasia, the nonspecific colitis, and pervasive developmental disorders. He looked at a very, very small sample of children and determined, just based on some blood tests, that there was a link between the MMR vaccine, the persistence of GI issues or the presence of GI issues, and then also autism in children. So this study has been retracted. I'm going to talk about why. So this is what he found in 12 kids. So first he found a link between colitis, or just general GI issues, and regressive autism. And we now know that, in fact, kids with autism have a higher rate of colitis and GI disturbances. So this part was not surprising. In the conclusion, the addition, although it was never included in the analysis, what Wakefield and his author said was that, well, MMR was given to all these kids. And by the way, MMR was also given to the kids without autism. But since the MMR was given to the kids with autism and colitis, that it must be the vaccine that triggered the colitis that then triggered autism. Now, I want to state again, the MMR vaccine was given to both groups, and the MMR vaccine was not really even systematically analyzed in these 12 kids. But that conclusion was made from this study. Now, even though there were some significant problems from this study, this was The Lancet. So this was a big journal, and the bell had been rung. And now across the world, there were concerns about vaccines and autism. It was eventually retracted after about 10 years because there were some ethical concerns about the need for some of the kids got a GI biopsy, but there were some ethical concerns and some concerns about the IRB. The original study that was submitted didn't actually include kids with autism. They didn't even have a diagnosis. They collected blood samples from those who did not have an autism diagnosis from Wakefield's 10-year-old's birthday party. The kids that came to the birthday party, they had blood collected. Andrew Wakefield actually at the time was applying for a vaccine patent of his own. He was also retained by lawyers a couple years earlier for an MMR class action suit that paid him $700,000. The data was manipulated, it was never replicated, and in fact, it really should have never been published in The Lancet. So when it was finally retracted, 10 of the original 12 articles in 2004 issued a partial retraction. So those were everybody but one person in Wakefield in 2004 kind of realized that they had overstepped. And so they wrote a letter to the Lancet and said, we want this retracted. And then in 2010, several years later, when a lot of this came out, the Lancet retracted the whole article. So in 2004, those 10 authors said, we wish to make it clear that in this paper, no causal link was established between MMR and autism, as the data were insufficient. Wakefield, on the other hand, as a response to that, said that the events or everything had been misrepresented, and he was doubling down and sticking his heels in about this. Since then, since 1998, Andrew Wakefield has been on the publication and public speaking circuit. He wrote a book. He also produced a movie called Protocol 7. I'm not going to go into that. I have a slide. I was going to show you the trailer, but you can Google it. He has been affiliated with our now Secretary of Health and Secretary of HHS, RFK Jr. He's been doing that for many, many years. So since he's in 1998, he also started a clinic in Texas that has since been shut down for kids who didn't want to be vaccinated in Austin, Texas. We're going to skip this. I can show you the trailer, but it's really not that interesting. It's a film about a mass conspiracy to hide adverse events from vaccines from the public, and somebody was killed. It should be more of a John Grisham novel, but it's really not even from the preview. It's not even that good. So once the original MMR vaccine and autism kind of theory came out, okay, so what is it about the MMR vaccine? What's going on within the MMR vaccine? Is it the antigen? What's going on? And at some point, it was determined that a preservative in the vaccine called thimerosal was the reason why. So the reason why thimerosal was such an easy target was that thimerosal is by weight 50% ethyl mercury. So mercury, of course, nobody wants to be exposed to mercury. I remember growing up at the age of original thermometers, and my mother used to tell me, don't bite, then you'll get exposed to mercury and you'll die. And then so there's a difference between ethyl mercury and methyl mercury. And methyl mercury is the one that pregnant women are still trained to avoid. It's in fish because coal burning power plants just throw mercury into the air. The mercury then settles into the water supply. And then the larger fish like tuna eat the smaller fish and start to accumulate mercury. Same with sharks. Ethyl mercury is a completely different, it still has the mercury, but it also has an ethyl group. So it doesn't get into the brain, or it doesn't get into the brain as quickly, and it is excreted a lot faster than methyl mercury is. But there was a theory that, in fact, this thimerosal was associated with autism. And it was, again, reinforced by RFK Jr. in a book called Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak. There was one study that was published that looked at the link between thimerosal and autism. It was published in kind of a so-so journal by Dr. Mark and David Geyer. Dr. Mark Geyer, who's since passed away, was this is a wild ride, by the way, so put your seatbelt on. Dr. Mark Geyer was an OBGYN who was able to make prescriptions or write prescriptions. And David is his son, who is now employed by the Department of Health and Human Services to do a vaccine autism study at the HHS level. So what they did is they took this kind of idea that thimerosal causes autism and they turned it into a theory that, in fact, and I'll talk about in a minute, actually I'll skip to it, that the high levels of mercury from vaccines triggered an increase in testosterone levels, which then led to autism. So they came up with this theory, didn't really test the theory, but they started treating kids with autism in a clinic that was run by David and Mark Geyer in Florida called the ASD centers. They were treating kids with a compound called Lupron. So many of you know Lupron because it's used for chemical castration. It's also used to prepare women for IVF. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing in general. We need Lupron. Many women need Lupron to conceive. But what they were doing is David, who has no medical degree, was seeing these families with autism, not with any sort of medical degree, evaluating them, and then having his father write the prescriptions for Lupron that would then be given to the child. Of course, this never did anything. And in fact, the Maryland State Board of Physicians, even though they were practicing in Florida, they had an office in Maryland, and Mark Geyer was actually a physician licensed in Maryland. They basically they found out what was going on and took his medical license away. They couldn't take away David's medical license because he had none. I believe that there might have been some sort of settlement on behalf of this ASD treatment centers on behalf of the families, in addition to taking away their license. So this whole thing has been kind of, posed in kind of like conspiracies from the very beginning. I do want to reinforce, in fact, that that the thimerosal was studied in some other scientific analyses. In 2004, The Institute of Medicine reviewed all those studies and concluded that there was no association between vaccines and autism, and studies kept getting published and published and published about vaccines and thimerosal and autism. Except for the flu vaccine in 2001, thimerosal was removed in all vaccines recommended for children 6 years and younger. Now, some of the advocates for the thimerosal and vaccine, the thimerosal and autism link said, oh, we won. They took it out because they know it causes autism. Actually, the FDA said, you know what? It's okay, you know, why not take it out? So they found an alternative preservative, but because they wanted to just generally decrease the amount of mercury in the environment, the FDA said, let's just take it out of vaccines. But of course, that was misinterpreted. So as I just briefly mentioned, in March of this year, it was announced that David Geyer is being hired by the Department of Health and Human Services to analyze data, even though, again, he has no medical degree or no higher education in data analysis. He was hired to run a study, which there has been very little transparency on about what they're looking for in this study, but the public has been told it's trying to study the link between vaccines and autism. So we already know, and I'll talk about them, that there are no links, but here we are. There is another study going on. So here's a brief knowledge check just to kind of keep you guys. So true or false? Andrew Wakefield's 1998 study linking the MMR vaccine to autism was later retracted due to ethical and scientific concerns. So true or false? Is this statement true? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on. In fact, this statement is true. I think it's the question is confusing because the whole doesn't link vaccines to autism, but in fact, the study was retracted due to ethical and safety concerns and scientific concerns. So then in 2020, there was a theory then set forth that it wasn't necessarily thimerosal, it wasn't the vaccine specifically, it was something else. It was vaccines, there are too many given at once, right? So is there too many vaccines given at once? And this was kind of perpetuated by Bob Sears, who wrote a book that suggested that vaccines be spaced out a little bit more. The scientific facts are that vaccines given at once do not overwhelm the immune system. Vaccines today actually have fewer antigens than they did 40 years ago. And only 1%, I guess Bob Sears being one of them, physicians agreed they should be spaced out. In fact, what happens when you space them out is if you're not giving them on time, you're leaving children vulnerable to vaccine preventable diseases. And also there was a study that said that actually very few parents go to all these spacing out vaccines, right? Or spacing out. So what ends up happening is there are some vaccine clinics or pediatricians' offices that say, all right, we'll work with you, but by age 3, if you're not caught up, you're out of our practice. And I know that that is a controversial decision, but it's a decision that some pediatricians have had to make. But this is another theory about vaccines causing autism that is not true. For some reason, I'm having problems advancing. In 2011, there was an article published in the Sunday Times that actually revealed all of this scandal, how Wakefield recruited kids at a birthday party, how he had all this conflict of interest. I've already told you, I've already given you the facts about it, but this wasn't really revealed until 2011. So think about from 1998 to 2011, all of the fear by parents, the scientific community. In fact, there was scientific research launched in the year 2000 to look at the link between vaccines and autism by the US government and other governments. And an enormous amount of analysis using existing data sets, which I'll talk about. There was even reports by the Institute of Medicine that looked at not just multiple immunizations and immune dysfunction, but also vaccines and autism, that the Immunization Safety Review group looked at it, met, brought in parents that were concerned, brought in scientists that thought they had found a link, sat around a table and discussed it. And at the end of the day, the Immunization Safety Review or the Institute of Medicine determined that there was no link between vaccines and autism. And in 2003, there was no link between thimerosal and autism. Since 2012, when the scandal was kind of repeated, the studies have still continued. So on the Autism Science Foundation website, there is study after study that mostly now are systematic reviews, and we have them listed that talk about the safety of vaccines and updated, and they look at the safety in broad terms and then autism specifically. Specific vaccines like MMR, which seem to cause the most problems in terms of PR. And then also there's been studies looking at different subgroups of autism. So those with a strong genetic family history link versus those that may not have a family history. What has been the link there? And I'll talk about that in a minute. So how do we know? Where is all this data coming from? So there are a number of different resources or data sets that these scientists can tap into. The CDC has a monitoring system. There's also the vaccine adverse event reporting system, which family members and doctors are encouraged to report back into. There's like a 1-800 number and a web form that if they believe there's a link between an adverse event, any adverse event, and a vaccine, they can fill out a form. This might be a little bit biased because it's only tracking the adverse events. There's also, though, the Vaccine Safe to Data link, which is a series of about 11, I believe, health HMOs that have electronic medical records where they can literally look at the timing of different vaccines, the timing of different outcomes or adverse events, and they can monitor everything else in a child's medical record, like their race, their gender, the age of onset, the medical comorbidities, everything else. And then there's also the ACIP, which was just, it was just reconstituted. First it was canceled, then it was reconstituted. They're looking not just at autism, they're looking at a number of different things. So when you hear stories about how we're not looking at vaccine safety or there's no commission looking at the safety of vaccines, there absolutely is, and that includes autism as well as other outcomes. But again, this is an autism presentation, and I won't get too deep in the weeds about vaccine safety in general. There's also been, in addition to these large-scale epidemiological research, there's also basic science, so cells in a dish, or animal research looking at the immune system after different vaccines are given. And because autism is a behavioral diagnosis, behavioral outcomes in anything from mice to zebrafish and even monkeys. And I will say there was a very large study done actually by one of Andrew Wakefield's employees that was funded by an organization called Safe Minds, which was formed because they believed that there was a link between vaccines and autism. They looked at different vaccine schedules. One, which was the vaccine schedule given like 20 years ago, the vaccine schedule given around 2010. And then they looked at different vaccines given individually, both at birth, at 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 15 weeks, and then 52 weeks. And this correlates to age of development in a monkey that would correspond to age and development in a human. And they looked at everything from social behavior, which is relevant to autism, to object concept permanence, which is a measure of a cognition, discrimination learning, which is cognitive flexibility, and then just basic reflexes, basic different motor reflexes. And I could get into the details of this study with you, but there was absolutely no difference in vaccine schedules or no vaccine versus some vaccines on any behavioral measure. And you can imagine that this somewhat angered the group that funded the study, but science is science and data is data. So that was the monkey study. There has been a plethora of epidemiological data. So what I thought would be kind of helpful is if I gave you kind of a primer about how to interpret epidemiological data and what the numbers mean. So when you see relative risk, and I mentioned in previous slides, 1 times, 2 times, here's how I'm going to show you how those numbers are calculated. So here you have a group of kids, just everybody. So let's say this is 1,000 random children in the United States. I know they're children. They could be adults, depending on the study. They could be infants. Let's just say they're children, and let's just say there's 1,000 of them or 100 of them, because that's an easy number to divide by. So some of these kids have an autism diagnosis, and Those are the kids that are in red. I don't actually know if these drawings have an autism diagnosis. This is just a way of describing a group of children, some of which have an autism diagnosis and some of them don't have an autism diagnosis. And so epidemiologists count that. They count the number of kids, they count the number of kids with autism, and then they also count the number of kids who have been vaccinated. So you have kids who have been vaccinated who don't have autism. You have kids that are vaccinated that do have autism. You have kids that have not been vaccinated and have autism, and you have kids that have not been vaccinated and do not have autism. And even within that, you might have kids, boys and girls. You might have kids from different demographic characteristics, but basically this is what you're doing. You're counting the number of kids, those that have autism, those that don't have autism, those that got vaccinated, and those that didn't get vaccinated. And what you do is you create like this four squares, I'll call it, and you count the number of kids who have autism that are vaccinated, the number of kids who have autism who are not vaccinated, the number of kids who don't have autism who are vaccinated, and the number of kids who don't have autism who are not vaccinated. And then the relative risk is the outcome of autism if they were vaccinated, and the outcome of autism if they weren't vaccinated. So if there is no difference between if you have 25% of the kids with autism vaccinated and 25% of the kids without autism vaccinated, you have a relative risk of 1. Those numbers are about equal. They're at the top and the bottom of a divisor and a numerator and a denominator. So you'll end up with a number around 1. If the number is below 1, it means whatever was given was protective. And if the number is greater than 1, like I described with air pollution and illness during pregnancy and all of those things, then there is an increased probability or an increased risk of an autism diagnosis. So that's basically where you're seeing this 1 number. So there have been many, many studies so far. This one was published in 2019 that are meta-analyses where they take all the different studies and they analyze the data so you could see along a line, this is the relative risk of 1. What is the relative risk of an autism diagnosis in males and females? So this is regardless of vaccination. And we know for many reasons that there is a lower risk or a lower rate of diagnosis in females. So this in itself is not surprising. Then you look at different cohorts and show that again between vaccinated and unvaccinated children, and this is with the MMR vaccine, that they hover around 1. In fact, they may be a little bit lower than 1, but they hover around 1. There is no difference. And then if you add in the DTaP and the Hib vaccine, either 1 or 2, in addition to the MMR vaccine, they hover maybe a little bit higher than 1, but also maybe a little bit lower than 1. So this is where they're getting this kind of amassing of data from multiple sites across multiple countries. So Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the United States, Israel, China, Japan. So there's many, many different countries that have actually reinforced the idea that that relative risk hovers around 1, and there is no difference between getting vaccinated and not being vaccinated in terms of an autism diagnosis. Again, they also looked at the time since the vaccination and autism diagnosis in the first year, the second year, the third year, the fourth year, again, hovered around 1. And then there's also, obviously, there's variability within that, but they hover around 1. So all of these studies are showing that there is no link between vaccines and autism. So another argument that had been made was that there are some individuals with a genetic vulnerability to autism. And how you can measure that in the population is families with 1 or more children with an autism diagnosis. And you can actually follow them prospectively, because we know that if you have 1 child with an autism diagnosis, the probability of having another child with an autism diagnosis can be as high as 40% or as low as 13%. That's much higher than the 3% by any numbers that you see in the general population. So it depends on whether or not you have 1 child with an autism diagnosis, whether that child is male or female, or whether the next child is male or female. The increase in probability for a diagnosis goes up if you have 2 or more children. This is a measure of the familial risk of an autism diagnosis if you have just one child with autism. So this tells you that there may be a specific vulnerable subgroup of people that are diagnosed with autism. I will tell you that these are families that are tracked from infancy. So you can look at in some of our earliest, some of the information about the very earliest signs and features of autism before 6 months are found using this baby siblings design. So you can track them as early as possible and then determine if they had an autism diagnosis or they didn't. But in the general population, it's about 3%. It goes up to as high as 40%. Or about 40% if you have 2 or more children. So what about looking at that group and finding out if they have increased probability of an autism diagnosis with vaccines? And a study did that in 2015. So here is an older sibling. This is a lot of data. And remember, we're looking at that 1 number, the relative risk of it being about 1. If there's an older sibling without autism and they had 1 dose of the MMR versus unvaccinated, and it was 1 and 1. So no difference between these 2 groups. Then you look at kids that did have an older sibling with autism. So this is that genetically vulnerable group. That number was 0.86. It wasn't statistically significant, but it shows a slight protection against an autism diagnosis. Again, not statistically significant. I'm not saying there's anything protective, but it certainly wasn't an increased risk of an autism diagnosis in this genetically susceptible group. And then you have, when you wait until they're 5 and they get multiple doses, and age 5 is also, age 4, they were waiting because sometimes kids aren't diagnosed with autism until age 4. Now you're waiting until age 5, 2 doses. And in fact, there is somewhat of a protection against a statistically significant protection. It's about half the rate of autism in those who have been vaccinated. And there's many reasons for that. I'm not suggesting that vaccines are protective against autism. I'm suggesting there is no association and people should get autism because it's the right thing. I mean, people should get vaccinated because they need to be protected against different diseases. So this didn't just happen by coincidence by Andrew Wakefield. This also happened that once the Andrew Wakefield study was published, that a lot of public people jumped on this bandwagon. So I don't know if many of you remember Jenny McCarthy. I remember her because she was on an MTV show when I was growing up. She is a model. Her child was diagnosed with autism. She and her, not the baby's father, her later boyfriend, Jim Carrey, who was a very famous actor, at least at the time, got into this movement that vaccines may have caused their child's autism. Robert De Niro is, a very well-known actor. Everybody knows who he is. He has gotten into the fray in terms of do vaccines cause autism? I don't know if you know Alycia Silverstone in the bottom left-hand corner. She's an actress. The guy, I can't even remember his name. He's a comedian, Rob something. He's a comedian and he'll go off in his stand-ups about how vaccines cause autism. And even our President Donald Trump has talked about how vaccines cause autism or how they should be further studied, which once you say that the question hasn't been answered, you create doubt in parents' minds. Again, Oprah Winfrey had Jenny McCarthy on her show, gave her a platform to talk about how she thought vaccines caused her son's autism. And in fact, all the social media activity, which there are tens of thousands of posts, can actually be tracked back to something called the disinformation dozen. So the people, there are 12 people in the world that are spreading, that are most likely to spread the information about how vaccines are linked to autism. One is Dr. Mercola. He actually runs a physician's practice where he gives kind of these alternate vaccine schedules and makes quite a bit of money off of his books. Another is the Director of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And then there's a number of other people that you may not have never heard of, but they are at the center of most of the public social media discourse around misinformation about how vaccines are linked to autism. So let's do another knowledge check. So which of the following statements best summarizes the current scientific consensus on the relationship between vaccines and autism? There's a strong evidence that vaccines cause autism, at least in some individuals. The evidence is inconclusive and more evidence is needed. Multiple large-scale studies have found no link between vaccines and autism, and vaccines only cause autism when given in combination. And you guys are getting it right. Multiple large-scale studies have found no link between vaccines and autism. So let's move on. What is discouraging people from vaccinating? So I already told you the risk of autism is very, very high, but it's not the only the only reason why people aren't vaccinating. A lot of people, it's just an independence thing. Don't tell me what to put in my body. Vaccines cause autism. Adjuvants or preservatives. So an adjuvant makes a vaccine work better, and a preservative makes sure that it can be preserved, and it can, like a bottle can be shipped, and you can use one vial and take many different vaccines from that same vial. So adjuvants or preservatives of vaccines are dangerous. I already mentioned thimerosal. There was a study that came out yesterday that showed that aluminum is not linked, aluminum and vaccines are not linked to autism. Vaccines are linked to the diseases they protect against or shedding. Like if you get the MMR vaccine, you're more likely to give it to someone else because you have that antigen in your body. That has not really, that is a thing, but it's not linked to autism, and it's really not very common. Vaccines cause autoimmune diseases, which are not true. There are too many vaccines too soon. We've already talked about that. There's a whole different level of conversation when you talk about vaccines to protect against things like human papillomavirus, that it's encouraging sexual promiscuity in teenagers. And then there are certain religious groups. There's certainly religious groups in New York City that are resistant against vaccines, even though some of the leaders of those religious groups have said, no, they're absolutely fine to get. But people have cited religious reasons. And in fact, that was a very common, you had people requesting vaccine exemptions for religious reasons who weren't even of that religion. So that's been completely misused. The reason why parents hesitate or prevent their child, or the reason why kids aren't getting enough vaccines, parental hesitancy and missed well child visits are number 1 and 2. So missed well child visits are another animal, but parental hesitancy is something that I hope that we can all address, especially when it comes to the links of vaccines. There is still kind of this mistrust of pharmaceutical or physicians, and then a lack of vaccine supply, which has been less of an issue. This was an AAP survey done in 2022. But again, missed well child visits, physicians, absolutely, we can try and make sure that kids don't miss their well child visits. But parental hesitancy, we can probably educate parents better. Unfortunately, trust in science is low. It's lower now than it was even before COVID. We have a fair amount or highest levels. This was even during COVID. It's higher now than it was even during COVID in terms of mistrust in scientists. And so having scientists be the only ones communicating this information is not working. The information should be scientific, but it should expand beyond just scientists delivering the information. Unfortunately, the reason why autism has been so particularly vulnerable to this autism and vaccine link is because what causes autism has been so steeped in controversy. So in the 1960s, a psychiatrist named Bruno Bettelheim published a paper called The Empty Fortress, suggesting that mothers who were not affectionate enough or loving enough to their children were the reasons why children had some sort of reactive attachment disorder and autism. This has been 1,000% proved untrue using the evidence I showed you earlier. But imagine from 1960, there's the thing in your head telling you that it's something that I did as a mother. And this went through from the 60s through the 70s through the 80s, that mothers were actually told that there was something that they did or could have done differently. And there was a huge amount of parental guilt, specifically on mothers. And so this kind of general historical attitude has been very pervasive, even to 2025. And so parents actually feel responsible for their child's autism and actually will cling onto anything that they can do to mitigate the probability that their child will have autism. Social media is no help. In fact, we talked about the disinformation dozen. During the 2020 election, there was an analysis done on where in addition to the disinformation dozen, some of the information about vaccines and autism was coming from, and they're coming from trolls and sophisticated bots. So they're not even coming from credible scientific sources. So what are the consequences? We already talked about vaccine hesitancy. This is leading to outbreaks for measles that have been deadly, especially in Texas, but it's spread all the way even to New Jersey, where a lot of people are vaccinated. And a way to get around this is, not to get around it, but a way to deal with it is to not just have scientists present information, but trusted medical professionals. And I titled this, We Listen and We Don't Judge, because a lot of families feel like if they say that they're vaccine hesitant or they have questions about vaccines, they're immediately going to get jumped on. So they will either avoid having that conversation by not getting the vaccine whatsoever, or lying about it, or just saying that they're not going to do it, even though they have questions about it. So what we really need, and there was a study done and published in Nature, that we need strong and clear communication. We need it done by people that are trusted by families, not just the scientists that work in the lab, but the medical care providers, the nurses, the pharmacists. We need to increase access to those materials. We need provider recommendations. That seems to be a key driver of vaccine uptake. Other things like vaccine champions, people in the community that can serve as ambassadors, being prepared for this misinformation so that you can easily respond and not just say, oh, well, let me look that up. The evidence on mandates have been mixed. They actually increase vaccine uptake, but there's been such backlash against them, especially in this post-COVID era, that a lot of states are opting out of vaccine mandates. And then other people are saying, well, what if we rather than mandate it, what if we incentivize it with tax breaks? And that seems to be helpful in a little bit, but really strong and clear communication and provider recommendation. So quick knowledge check, delaying or true or false? Delaying or skipping vaccines is a recommended way to reduce the risk of an autism diagnosis. Perfect. It's false. This is not a way to reduce the risk of an autism diagnosis. And in fact, one of my big fears about all this vaccine autism controversy is that people are going to have a false sense of security if they don't vaccinate their child. They're not going to be worried about well-child visits. They're not going to be worried about meeting developmental milestones. They're not going to be worried or even concerned about bringing their concerns about their child to a physician, because they're just going to think that they're automatically protected, and they certainly are not. Autism Science Foundation has published something that we hope is very simple, clear, talks about everything that I mentioned here today, and it is supposed to go to families in different medical practices. It was authored by our founder and president, Allison Singer, and Antonio Pisani, and then the board chair of Vaccinate Your Family. There is a link here. I think you can also Google it. We also have on the Autism Science Foundation, if you ever want to refer families, a list of the publications around autism and vaccines. So you go to the Autism Science Foundation website, and it's under Autism Basics. There are also the AAP or other advocacy groups are putting together kind of like infographics that are simple, that can be distributed to different places. Hopefully they'll be viewed widely, that are very simple and concise, either stories from families themselves or scientific information or both. And one of them was, for years, I believe my vaccines caused my son's autism, and I was wrong, and here's why. So in summary, the history of the proposed link between vaccines and autism has been riddled with controversies and ethical problems. I just touched the surface of this, and you can already see it's just riddled with scandal. 2 decades of research from around the world, hundreds of millions of dollars, different cultures, different healthcare systems, different countries, show that there's been no link between vaccines and autism. And trusted medical professionals and people that work with families have this unique opportunity to reach families who are vaccine hesitant by explaining the science in a clear and consistent and concise way, and meeting families where they are. Some families just have questions, and you should feel free to answer those questions without recrimination. Some of them are going to be more anti-vaccine and not want a vaccine. And frankly, you can only do so much, right? Like you have other patients to see, they're stuck in their ways. But I think it's those families that have questions that are honestly just trying to learn information that are the ones that can be addressed the most
Thank
easily.
you, Dr. Halladay, for an incredible presentation. All right. I don't think we have a ton of time, but I thought maybe I'll ask you one or two that came in, if that's
Sure.
okay. Dr. Halladay?
Sure,
Okay.
sure, sure. Sorry.
One is, how do you suggest responding to families of certain nationalities that believe their children here in the US are at risk of these vaccines based on lower autism rates in their home country?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and that's a really good question. So one of the, as I mentioned, the increase in prevalence of autism is driven by access to services, at least here in the United States, and actually that's been shown in other countries as well, like South Korea. The more you look for autism, the more you're going to find it. So I would emphasize that in certain countries, and this is just a really sad reality. In some countries, there is just one or two. There's there is no developmental pediatrician. There's a pediatrician that's dealing with a wide range of issues, including nutrition and other communicable diseases, and they don't have time to talk about autism. And I would say that in many countries, autism is grossly underdiagnosed because of access to services and physician or professional expertise in that country, and that's just the sad reality of it. There are publications that you can look at to say what the current prevalence is in each country. Certainly, the prevalence of autism, say in the United States and Canada and the UK, is a lot higher than it is in places like Kenya or some African countries or some countries in Indonesia for that very reason. So I can completely understand why that would be a concern.
Yes, thank you for that. There's a few similar in that same theme, so I think we addressed that. I'll just ask one more here. Someone commented the exposure odd ratio slide is very interesting. Are you aware of any data looking at vaccination during pregnancy in a similar way? I wonder if vaccines during pregnancy provide any protective effect to a subsequent autism diagnosis.
That's a great question. In fact, you would think if there was like a higher risk of autism if you're ill, right? So say there is a link, which they haven't shown yet because we just don't have the data yet. They're collecting it. Trust me, they're collecting it, but we don't have the data yet. That if you have a severe case of COVID, you're very, very ill, you're running a temperature, you're going to the hospital, you need medical intervention, that has been linked to autism in a wide range of illnesses. So if you protected against COVID through a vaccination and you protected getting sick, would you see the prevalence of autism change if somebody had a vaccine against COVID during pregnancy? In fact, the data on that shows that there's neither an increase or a decrease in the probability of having a child with autism. And in fact, they are very safe in kids with autism. So there's also confusion that my child with autism shouldn't get vaccinated because they are immunocompromised or can't handle the vaccines, and that's been addressed. But I think it would be very interesting to show a study looking at vaccine as a protection. It has not been addressed yet. Actually, so if that person wants to email me, I'm happy to get into a discussion because and provide more details because that's one of those genetically higher risk questions that those families are less likely to get vaccinated because they're concerned about that, but yet they have a higher rate of an autism diagnosis. So that follows along that. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer.
Very interesting. Thank you for those. And thank you again for joining us today, everyone. We look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you, Dr. Halladay.
Thank you so much for attending. And I'm sorry I didn't get to meet all of you personally, but please email me if you have any questions or need any references or resources.